Dennis Allen gave an interview to the Saints website. Saints website's done a pretty good job during the shutdown of catching up with coaches and players and things like that, and trying to keep as much Saints content churning as they can during the coronavirus shutdown. We'd normally be seeing rookie mini camps and then OTAs and mini camps before they get into their formal off-season training with training camp later in the summer. But Dennis Allen gave an interview to John DeShazer at the Saints website about the Saints and what he's been doing for the defense here in this offseason. And a couple of things that stood out, maybe mostly was Dennis Allen saying, what we really said during this offseason was, how are we going to do these things better? And how are we going to teach these things better? And that's really where our focus has been. It's been about fine-tuning all the little details to everything that we're doing defensively, from verbiage to terminology to fundamentals and technique. Really trying to hone in on exactly the things that we want to teach, exactly the terminology we wanted to do to use that. You know what's interesting is the Saints only lose 2 starters off of last year's defense. And I would actually argue that they're better in both spots. Vonn Bell and Eli Apple out. Malcolm Jenkins, Janoris Jenkins in. I would make a pretty strong argument that, and most would agree certainly, that Janoris Jenkins fills in a spot where the Saints were deficient a year ago. I liked the idea when they got Eli Apple a couple of years ago, a former first-round pick, give him an opportunity to play opposite Marshawn Lattimore, less pressure, new environment might have been good for Eli Apple, getting him out of New York. And he just struggled, quite honestly. He frankly just struggled at times. And Janoris Jenkins is a guy that still has a lot of really good football ahead of him. So I think you're better there. And then we all know the feeling that Sean Payton has about Malcolm Jenkins. As smart and cerebral a player as he is, certainly into his 30s, closer to the end of his career than the beginning, but a guy that could be that defensive captain you need in the secondary that's going to prevent some of the breakdowns and busts. And I'm for it. A guy that culturally fits in with what the New Orleans Saints want to do. Sean Payton's often said, letting Malcolm Jenkins go is one of the biggest mistakes he's made. I mean, there's been a couple of them. Rob Ninkovich is on that list as well, but Malcolm Jenkins is certainly at or near the very top of that. Regrets of remember, they let Malcolm Jenkins go and they paid Jairus Byrd, make him the richest safety in NFL history, and that became literally the worst free agent signing that the Saints have ever made, considering the money they paid and the complete and abject lack of productivity they got from Jairus Byrd. So I understand why, for many reasons, Sean Payton regretted that decision. But when I look at where the Saints need to improve on defense, I actually started peeling back the layers of the onion today, because you heard Dennis Allen in that quote say it's about fine-tuning the little details. So I'm like, all right, so whenever I hear that, I think, okay, where was the deficiency? If there was one. And so I start kind of putting pen to paper. The Saints a year ago in total defense, they were 11th in total defense. Rush defense, 4th. Pass defense, 20th. Scoring defense, 13th. Turnover margin, 2nd. Sacks, 3rd with 51 sacks. Third down defense, 8th. We forget sometimes this team was 13-3. They were really stinking good, man. And they have been for the last 3 years. We focus too much on the playoff disappointments, but I understand why we do. I understand why we focus on the playoff disappointments, because ultimately the goal is not to win a bunch of games in the regular season, it's to win championships. So when the Minneapolis Miracle or the Nola no call or the Kyle Rudolph push-off happens, we're going to focus on that, on the absolutely horrific ways in which these seasons have ended, but it shouldn't blind us from the fact that these teams have been fantastic the last 3 years. No team, I've said this a lot this offseason, but no team in the NFL over the last 3 years has won more games than the New Orleans Saints. They've won 37 games over 3 years. 11-5, 13-3, 13-3. That's remarkable. They just don't have a lot they need to work on. Like, I've heard a lot of people this offseason, a lot of Saints fans have commented and said they need a pass rusher. Do they really? Because the Saints had 51 sacks a year ago. That was third in the NFL. 51 sacks. You've got Cam Jordan, who's virtually unblockable, had 15 and a half sacks last year. Marcus Davenport had 6. And remember, his season ended prematurely. You get Davenport back healthy, and you have other guys there that have picked up the slack. If it's Trey Hendrickson, Demario Davis from his linebacker position. I don't know that the Saints desperately need Jadeveon Clowney or Everson Griffin. Would it be nice to have one of those guys? Absolutely. Do you need it? You were third in the NFL in sacks last year. You don't need another interior player to stuff the run. Hopefully Sheldon Rankins can stay healthy again. But you did really well last year in free agency, adding guys like Malcolm Brown. And then you did fantastic in undrafted free agency with Shai Tuttle and with Taylor Stallworth. And you were fourth in the NFL in rush defense. Hell, the Saints haven't allowed a 100-yard rusher since Jim Haslam was the coach. I know that's an exaggeration, but you understand my point. It's been like 30-some-odd games since they've allowed a 100-yard rusher. Now, Dalvin Cook should have in the playoff. He had like 90 yards in the first half. He finished with 94, but I digress. Like the one spot statistically where you were deficient, you were 20th in the NFL in pass defense, and you've upgraded there. 2 spots in your secondary. I think you're better at both spots. You're better with Malcolm Jenkins over Vonn Bell, and I think you're better with Janoris Jenkins over Eli Apple. The devil's in the details. I think I'd love to know, Dennis Allen talking about fine-tuning his defense and figuring out exactly where they want to, how they want to teach things from verbiage and so on, how they're going to become incrementally better, and if that could be the thing. But realistically, man, when I look at the Saints' losses last year, San Francisco was the outlier. That game where you allow 48 points against San Francisco in a game where the teams combined for 100 points, like, okay. But again, that's an outlier, and sometimes outliers happen. The other 2 losses, the Saints scored 9 points in those games. The game in L.A. where Breeze was injured, Saints scored 9 points and lost that game to the Rams, and then they scored 9 points in that home game to Atlanta. Your problem wasn't on defense in those games. The problem was you couldn't score. The problem in the playoff game against the Vikings wasn't your defense. Dalvin Cook was great in the first half, but you shorted up in the second half. The problem was you couldn't score. It certainly feels like they addressed the offensive line. They've given Drew Brees even more weapons this year. They added Ty Montgomery. You know what I mean? Like they added Emmanuel Sanders. You've added Cesar Ruiz. You've gone in free agency and added some veteran offensive linemen to give you even more options to keep Drew Brees upright. You trade up to get Adam Troutman. Maybe he makes an impact as a pass-catching tight end this year. Maybe not, but maybe he does. I think when you look at where your deficiencies were and where in your losses last year, Saints have very much addressed those. You're better in the secondary. You're better on the offensive line, and you've given Drew Brees more options, more weapons. Like, if I'm looking at this team from a year ago and saying, okay, what prevented the Saints from being the number 1 seed? And what prevented the Saints from advancing in the playoffs? They've addressed each of those. They've checked each of those boxes. I just don't think the defense is a big problem. I think they're going to be really good again this year.